Hi, everyone. This month, we expect to see something different and new in America that we've never actually seen before. It will be the first time that you'll be able to walk into your local pharmacy and purchase a birth control pill without a prescription. Here's a little background on this story. Last year, in the middle of the summer, the FDA approved the first over the counter birth control pill, saying that this particular pill would be available without a prescription at drugstores, convenience stores, and grocery stores, as well as online. This ignited a lot of headlines, although we didn't have a lot of details. We didn't know exactly when this over the counter birth control pill would suddenly appear in our grocery stores. We didn't have a date. We didn't know the price. We didn't know how expensive it could be or how inexpensive it could be. And we weren't quite sure if there would be any additional requirements to consider. The reporting at the time suggested there would be no age restrictions, but we wondered, would that actually be the case? Would you have to show your ID, even though it's over the counter? What would this actually look like in practice? So there were a lot of questions left unanswered. And just recently, we have some new reporting. The maker of the first approved over the counter birth control pill just announced that it will come to store shelves in the next few weeks. In fact, more specifically, this month in the month of March. And it will be available for $19.99 for a month's supply, so just under $20. Or you could buy a 3-month pack for $49.99. And if we did the math, we figured, okay, if you were going to do this for a year, it would cost you roughly $200. So let's pause for a moment. Those are some of the details that we know. Let's just talk a little bit about the context or the background here. The US government first approved birth control, the birth control pill, in 1960. And obviously, it's commonly referred to as, quote unquote, the pill. It's also been called, quote, one of the most socially significant advances in modern medicine. And in many countries around the world, you can already receive it without a prescription. The United States was one of the places where you still needed to see a doctor and get a prescription for this sort of medication, this sort of drug. It has also become the subject of controversy and questions over the years, whether you're talking about questions about health or science or culture or society. There's been all sorts of questions involving the birth control pill. And those continue despite the many decades that it has been on the market. So I wanted to look at this headline with a unique lens, with someone that could really talk to us about women's health. And I was lucky to be able to interview one of the premier doctors on women's health and hormones. I first heard of Dr. Sara Gottfried on the Huberman Lab podcast. This is a podcast run by Andrew Huberman, PhD. He explores topics on science and health and dives really deep with all sorts of fascinating people. I'll put the link to this particular podcast I'm mentioning in our show notes so you can explore it too. I think you'll be just as struck as I was with this conversation with Dr. Gottfried. It was a conversation that I listened to and sent to all my family and friends because I thought it was so interesting. And I thought, wow, she's a fascinating interview. I'd love the opportunity to talk to her, but when in the news cycle are we going to get that opportunity? It's very specific. Doesn't seem like it'll be that likely. And then lo and behold, we actually have this opportunity. So several weeks after the news came out from the FDA, we actually sat down and had a conversation. And unfortunately, the way the news cycle was moving at the time, it didn't really allow me to interject this conversation into our regular coverage on Smarter News. It just didn't feel right. And so I was sort of waiting for just the right opportunity. Dr. Sara Gottfried is a practicing clinician. She's also a New York Times bestselling author of books like The Hormone Cure or Women, Food, and Hormones. She also has a brand new book out this month, The Autoimmune Cure, where she talks about a prism, a lot of different areas of science, including how health is affected by trauma. You're going to hear her talk a little bit about this at the beginning of this interview, because this has certainly informed her work. And that's one of the reasons why I really enjoyed listening to her and wanted to talk to her on this particular subject, because she was looking at health as a combination, a collage of many different things, not just one thing, not just one body of research, but many different things. And I really enjoyed that about her. And I enjoyed that in our conversation as well. I hope you really enjoy this conversation. Although we recorded it a couple months ago, it feels just as fresh and even more relevant now that we're expecting to see this change. So without further delay, without further ado, I'd like to present our conversation with Dr. Sara Gottfried on the science and the story of the first over-the-counter birth control pill approved in the United States of America. And Dr. Gottfried, I'm so grateful to have you spend a little time with us. And I'd love to just ask you before we launch into some of the headlines, how did your own story lead you to science and health? What was it about this particular area that you felt called to?
Well, thank you for that introduction, Jenna. It's such a pleasure to meet with you and to expand on this topic. So, like for many clinicians, it came out of my own crisis. I was a hormonal hot mess in my 30s, and that got me to shift from conventional medicine to a more integrative, functional, and precision-based approach. And I realized that I sometimes joke that I've had every hormone imbalance that a woman could possibly have. And I was also failed by the conventional medical system. It just didn't solve my problems the way that I had hoped. I was a really stressed out 30 something who had two kids, couldn't lose the baby weight, had PMS, struggled with belly fat. And, my doctors were basically saying exercise more and eat less. And that just fell flat for me. And I realized we got to do better than this. We got to do better by American women around the world. So that's what got me started on this quest.
And when you were in the middle of that, because what you described, I'm sure many of our audience can relate to, how did that feel? Especially with your science background. It's one thing to experience that as an individual of any sort of a background. But what was the feeling that was attached to that?
Well, the feeling first was isolation, feeling dismissed by the primary care doctor that I saw, who basically, along with exercise more and eat less, as I was telling him about my list of woes, feeling stressed, feeling like it was hard to wind down at night, feeling like mothering was really difficult and juggling that with work was challenging. Um, Finding that my libido was not what it used to be. I felt dismissed. I felt even a little gaslit. Oh, you're just getting older. Oh, you're just a mom. Oh, you're just a working mom. And it's not helpful. It's not helpful. And oh, how about a little Prozac? That's what was on offer at that time. So it felt isolating. It felt frustrating. And then it made me a little angry. That kind of righteous anger that can move mountains and start revolutions and change the conversation. So that's how it felt.
And is it all hormones? By the way, I relate to that anger. I think it was more associated with the news, with the
Yeah.
media, but I
Yeah.
completely understand that. And also that look of, oh, you just need um, more sleep.
Yeah.
You need more sleep. You need to drink more water. All those
Have you
things.
heard of yoga? Yeah. Have you heard of meditation?
Right.
Yes, I'm a meditation teacher. It's not enough.
You're like, yeah, that's not enough. But thank you for the suggestions. So in that paradigm that you just described for us, did you find, and as you were finding your way through it and you're navigating this difficult time, is it all hormones? Is that what it really do all of those roads lead back to hormones and not necessarily yoga and exercise and drinking more water, all of which we probably need to do some?
Hormones are a big part of it. So for me, hormones were about 80%. Hormones were the portal that led to transformation for me. And then I paid it forward to my patients and started working in a way that creates natural hormone balance for the patients that I take care of. It's not all of it. What I learned over the years is that, yes, I can get my cortisol so much better. I can get my estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone so much better. But then I discovered that I have a fair amount of trauma that I had to work through. And trauma disrupts not just your hormones, it disrupts your psychological system, the PINE network, your immune system, neurological, your nervous system, and your endocrine system. So trauma is part of it too. At this point, I think after the pandemic, very few of us are unscathed by trauma. And so hormones are a big part of it. Getting my hormones back into balance really helped a ton, but it's not the whole story. There's much more to it.
It's interesting you mentioned the part about trauma and about your past, and that's what I was referencing in the introduction, which is something that I don't think I've heard any sort of clinician talk about, which is there are times in your life where you have been able to, and I'm just saying any sort of in general individual, power through. And
Yeah.
then it catches up to you at a certain point. And it is also often at the same time when the aging process seems to become more noticeable, more visible, just at that timeline. And
Yeah.
so those things intersecting together can make things a little confusing because there's some things to sort through. How did you realize that? How did you come to that realization that that was part of it, that it was a real part that needed to be discussed, not just something to meditate on?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'm gonna like process this in real time with you. Some of it is being a book author. So being a book author forces you to confront the pieces of your life that maybe are still dysregulated. And for me, what I found was that I had some challenges in my marriage. And I've been married for almost 20 years. And there was a way that we weren't able to regulate each other the way that I think a marriage is meant to. I really think of marriage as being a sanctuary. So we have two amazing children. Um, they're the light of my life. But I would say my marriage really kind of showed me the ways that I still needed healing. And as I started to look around at my practice, I saw this a lot, especially the people that I would take care of who had sex lives that they weren't totally satisfied with, or they just felt like they constantly had high perceived stress, no matter how much yoga and meditation and vacations they went on. And I realized that a lot of the people who were getting better, they were fine. Like they graduated from my care, which is what I want ultimately. But then there were folks who really were more stuck. And I noticed this thread of trauma. So as I started to look more at trauma and to learn more about trauma, I mean, I started studying it 30 years ago at Harvard Medical School, but as I started to look more at it, I realized many of my clients and patients have significant trauma. And when I realized that, I started to take an inventory and look at things like the adverse childhood experiences score in my patients, and I discovered a ton of trauma. So it's one of the root causes of hormone imbalances. It certainly was for me. And then once you discover it, you want to do something about it. And that led to, for me, a search for, what type of breath work can really help you create a healing state of consciousness. I found that holotropic breath work was really effective for me. I discovered that psychedelic assisted treatment is really effective for me. And so that's what my next book is about trauma, how it connects to the pine system, how it shows up in all these various ways, including hormone imbalances, including the ones that I had in my 30s.
Wow. That's going to be, when is that book going to be out, Dr. Gottfried? I'm just curious.
So it's due
Is
in
it-
March of 2024.
I like how you say it's due in March. So that's what it's at. I know, I know what that
It's
process
supposed to
is
be
like.
published. It's supposed to be published then. Yeah.
Well, it's that sounds fascinating. I can't wait to hear more about that. And it seems like such a natural progression for some of your work that's already out there. Real quick before I move to this headline, and then that's going to get us kind of to the next stage to talk more specifically about some of the things we're hearing about hormones today. If I'm just curious, because this may be a natural question for someone listening as well. If you don't is dealing with trauma could be something that could take a long time
Yeah.
and it could seem almost insurmountable. Is it the process of dealing with trauma or the openness to dealing with it, not the end conclusion of quote unquote solving it, that is an important part of looking at hormones and looking at your overall health? Because I think if someone had to master trauma or get a victory over it, gosh, I wonder if that's even possible.
Yeah, I think that's maybe the not quite the right approach. It feels like a maybe overly masculine approach to feel like you've
Mhm.
got to, you know, power
When?
through it. And
Hmm.
when, I think it's much more about befriending trauma, noticing the trauma that you've been exposed to, noticing how we tend to minimize. A lot of us agree about what's traumatic. 9/11 was traumatic. Um, the Holocaust was traumatic. Those are big T traumas. A severe car accident is traumatic, capital T. But there are these small T traumas that so many of us experience. And depending on your sensitivity, I'm a highly sensitive person, it can really cause a lot of dysregulation. So I think the key is to notice what type of trauma you've been exposed to. Gabor Mate talks about how trauma is not the event itself, it's the way that it lives on in your body, the way that it continues to dysregulate you. And depending on your particular body, mind, spirit, it might live on as problems with your glucose. It might live on as a metabolic problem where you hoard fat because your insulin is high. Or it might live on as an autoimmune condition. It might live on as a nervous system that just doesn't feel safe. So I think with trauma, it becomes knowing what you've been exposed to and awareness of how you might be dysregulated by the trauma you've been exposed to. And then a search for what's going to be effective for you. And it's not like okay, I'm going to, fix this trauma and I'm going to be done with it in 3 months. It's more, okay, I discovered that Hakomi is really helpful for me. It's a somatic based mindfulness form of therapy. I've discovered that EMDR is really effective for me. I've discovered that ketamine assisted treatment is really effective for me. So it's uncovering these things that help you address the dysregulation, maybe befriend and change the story that you have about the traumatic experience you've had. To me, that's the path of healing. It's about creating wholeness. It's not about victory over.
That's really helpful. As you're speaking, I'm also reflecting on how we approach prescription medicine or even over the counter medication to be that fix, which is a completely kind of different way of looking at health than what you just described. And I thought that was a really important part to make sure we had in the background here, because as we see access to different medications, this is why there's some broader questions about it. Not just, hey, is this going to make me gain weight, or is this going to, affect my sleep? It's there's a bigger picture of your health. So let's talk a little bit about this. I'm just curious what you thought when you saw the FDA make this announcement. What went through your mind? How did you generally feel about the idea that a birth control pill could be available over the counter for potentially no age restrictions, but we'll see, or requirements? What was your thought on that? How do you feel?
My first response is hooray, because women need more choices, not fewer. And our reproductive freedom is under attack right now. So I'm going to be careful not to be overly political. Um, I know your show is nonpartisan, so I will.
But my show is nonpartisan, and we'll talk about some of the things because I think the timing of this is really important. So I have it also in my notes to talk about. But I want to be really clear, that's not a requirement of our guests. You are free to have your opinion, and we want to talk to you because of your expertise. If I only interviewed people that were nonpartisan, then there would be very few. So I want you to you should be able to speak freely and comfortably about how you feel about this topic. You're coming at it as a woman, as a mom, as a clinician, and I'm really curious your thoughts on it.
Well, let me start first with my science hat on. So I think this is a huge achievement. And in terms of the risk of the birth control pill being over the counter, I would say alcohol is so much more dangerous than the birth control pill. So alcohol is readily available. I've got, um, I don't want to like break her anonymity, but let's just say 18-year-olds have a lot of fake IDs these days. And so alcohol is readily available and it is so much more dangerous, especially for the female body, than birth control pills are. Now, that said, I also really believe in body literacy. I really believe that you need to know deeply what's going on with your body, know the natural rhythms, be in tune with them, have a sense of like what the normal menstrual cycle is supposed to look like. And the birth control pill doesn't regulate your hormones, it basically just suppresses them. So you mentioned age, and I think with body literacy, there's probably an age-related component. I know a lot of 18-year-olds who have a lot of body literacy, and I know a lot of 18-year-olds who don't. And so I am concerned about younger women being exposed to birth control pills without adequate informed consent about what the pill can do. And we can talk a little bit about what some of those risks are. But for the most part, I would say women need more choices, not less. And this is an achievement for women.
What are some of the risks with birth control use? Uh, really, I guess we could take it at any age, but let's say prolonged use that doesn't necessarily have an oversight of a physician. Can you walk us through some of what's known and maybe what are some of the things that you're thinking about if someone made the choice to take birth control without any quote unquote oversight?
So there's a number of risks. The first is that the traditional birth control pill with estrogen and progesterone, it's got a synthetic progestin, which can affect the mood of women who take it. So a lot of women stop the birth control pill because of mood effects. It can cause dysphoria, kind of a negative mood. The second is long-term use is associated with a modest but significantly increased risk of breast cancer. And that's been published in the New England Journal of Medicine. So there's a lot of mixed data and confusion about this, especially among the studies that are funded by the pharmaceutical companies that make birth control pills. There's millions of women who take the birth control pill, and it's a lot of money for pharmaceutical companies. But this breast cancer risk is real, so we want to pay attention to that. The birth control pill can increase your risk of blood clots. So it's the estrogen component, ethinyl estradiol, that can do that. And so you want to be aware of that, especially if you've got the genetics that put you at a greater risk of blood clotting. And then you add a birth control pill, maybe without adequate informed consent. You just need to be aware that you might form a blood clot. You might, there's some risk of stroke. You don't want to take it if you've got high blood pressure because that increases your risk. So there are some components that there's value to a clinician doing some informed consent in this process. So those are some of the basic informed consent. There's certain contraindications to taking the birth control pill. And then if I put on my more integrative and functional hat, there are other factors that you want to consider, such as being on the birth control pill. Again, the classic one with estrogen and progesterone can raise something called sex hormone binding globulin, and that soaks up free hormone in your body, especially testosterone. And so the very reason that you might be taking the birth control pill, such as to have intercourse and not get pregnant, it can then decrease your libido. It can cause vaginal dryness in up to 20% of women. And that's the greatest irony, right? You go on it to have more sex, and then suddenly you don't want to have sex and you have dryness. So you want to be aware of those things. Some women can have dryness to the point that the vulva becomes more irritated and it can be painful to have sex. And it can also deplete you of certain micronutrients like the B vitamins, magnesium. And if you're someone who's stressed, like I was in my 30s, that just kind of adds insult to injury. So you want to be aware of that. It can increase inflammation, kind of those puffiness that we can get in the body. The immune system can get activated. So the way that we measure that is a blood test called C-reactive protein. We know the birth control pill, the classic birth control pill, can raise the C-reactive protein by about 2 to 3-fold. So those are some of the things that you want to be aware of. But then you have to balance that with what are the risks of getting pregnant? What are the risks of unprotected intercourse? And being pregnant is not the safest thing either. There's lots of risks associated with that, from the rising maternal mortality rate that we have in the US, especially among our BIPOC patients. We've got the issue of gestational diabetes, blood sugar problems during pregnancy, high blood pressure, preeclampsia, HELLP syndrome. So pregnancy is not necessarily benign either. And whenever we look at the risks of something like a birth control pill, we have to weigh it against the risk of an unplanned pregnancy.
Well, also go back since I mentioned a question about the risk, let's go a little further on the benefits too, to what it sounded like you were talking about a couple answers back, which was about agency and the importance of agency and choice. How do you see that as being a potential benefit to one's health physically or psychologically or otherwise?
So, agency is critical. I would say agency is the reason why I said hooray at the beginning when you asked me about the headline, because women need more agency. We just don't have access to agency the way that we need. And so I feel like women definitely need more choices, not fewer. We need to have access to things like birth control pills so that we don't have the barriers that exist right now.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a crisis in the United States, especially in terms of access to good healthcare. On average, the appointments that women have with their doctor are about 7 minutes. Is that enough time to get adequate informed consent for a birth control
Is that
pill?
real? 7 minutes?
7 minutes is the average. So
Wow.
I think better access, better agency is really critical. But it needs to be alongside body literacy. It needs to be alongside, accepting responsibility for taking something like a birth control pill, taking it upon yourself to really notice the effects on your body, and being aware of some of these risk benefits and alternatives so that you can make a good decision for yourself. And what's right for one woman may not be the right choice for you.
Well, it definitely gave us some perspective when you mentioned alcohol. Like, when you start listing the things that are available to people on a regular basis, like cigarettes,
Right.
alcohol, and the
Right.
warning labels on that, then you do have some context of, "Oh, that's right." Well, let me ask you a couple kind of these are, I don't wanna say quick questions, but I'm curious, what would be your reaction? So for this particular pill, for what it's worth, the one that would be made available is progesterone only. What does that mean, and why does that matter?
Yeah, so it's a synthetic progesterone. It's not actually progesterone, it's a progestin, which is the name for basically a synthetic form of the progesterone that your body makes. So, progestin can have a lot of mood effects. We use the progestin only birth control pill, especially in women who are postpartum, who are taking, they're breastfeeding, and so they don't want the estrogen to affect their breast milk supply. And what we know is that there's a lot of breakthrough bleeding when you take the progestin only birth control pill. And that can be a little bit tricky because there's also a failure rate that's higher with the
Mm.
progestin only birth control pill. So when you have bleeding, is that because of the progestin only pill, unscheduled bleeding, or is it because you're pregnant? So there needs to be some awareness that the efficacy is not the same as the regular birth control pill, the conventional classic birth control pill with estrogen plus progestin. And you need to have a low threshold to check for pregnancy.
And you have to take it at the same time. You're supposed to take it really at the same time every
So
day,
it's
right?
really
Which is part of
critical.
it?
Yeah, so, there's a little more flexibility in the timing with the classic birth control pill, and for the progestin only, we sometimes call it the mini pill. You have to take it, at precisely the same time. So I usually tell my patients to set a timer with their phone so that they are taking it, ideally within about 15 minutes every day.
Wow. What about an age issue here? I mean, I know you're the mom of daughters. Um, I have a daughter. It's already teaching me so much. She's 7, and yet I'm like, wow, there's gonna be so many years of learning ahead of me. She's wonderful. I love her so much. But do you feel that there should be, I mean, some sort of age restriction or requirement here? What are your thoughts about keeping it behind the counter with the pharmacist? What do you think? Because that's not determined yet.
Yeah, I mean, this is the argument of autonomy and agency versus helping younger women develop body literacy. So I don't know where the FDA has landed in terms of age restrictions. Uh, I think that it's really hard to say that there's an age
Mhm.
cutoff because I know 16-year-olds who are really adept at understanding their body and really responsible and are able to take something like the mini pill every day at the same time. And then I know 16-year-olds who are not. So I don't know that there's an age that makes more sense or is more appropriate. And the trade-off with having the pharmacist do some counseling is that fewer young women are gonna get it because they don't wanna go
Mhm.
through that. What do you think? Do you have, like, an
That's
age?
it's so interesting to me. I really don't know what to think about it, but I do have a personal experience to share that I think could also broaden this out. So in my teenage years, I was trying to remember how old I was. I think I was maybe just entering college. It was a long time ago. See, this is why I'm thinking back on it. But I had really bad cystic acne
Mhm.
for a lot. I mean, it started, my high school years. I could try managing. I tried a lot of different prescriptions. I tried a lot of medications. I did elimination diets. I really went through it. I was, in San Francisco, born and raised. So I did all the things, all the juju, all the things to try. You name it, I tried it. And at a certain point, the doctor was like, "Would you just go on birth control?" And it wasn't for the reason of needing it, for that particular reason. But I ended up staying on birth control for a very long time, which leads me to a question of this being available and then being used for different reasons, such as that. I don't know if this particular pill would be used for that, but if there's one that's being announced by the FDA, there's others likely to come. And I don't know if I really understood the risk, if they're all of the risks, but that was definitely a longer span of use that had nothing to do with preventing pregnancy. And
Right.
so that's what when I'm thinking about this, that's one of the personal experiences I'm bringing to it, even thinking about, you know, the children around me and what are some of the choices that they may be making as they get older. So what do you think about that? Looking back on that conversation with the doctor, I thought, wow, I really should have asked some more questions, but I didn't even have the context to ask them. And I just thought, no big deal. And I do remember this. The doctor actually said to me, again, I didn't need it for preventing pregnancy. Oh, you're going to need this eventually. So you might as well just start it now. I
Woo.
don't know if that was a moral judgment of some sort that was happening at the time, but I think it was just like, you're a young woman, at some point you're gonna be on this anyway, so just, it's fine, and it'll help, and guess what? It did help for a little while until it didn't anymore, and so that's probably a broader conversation now that I'm more educated about when it comes to some other questions I should have been asking then. So, what do you think about that scenario, though? Because I don't think that's unusual of, "Oh, you have PMS. Oh, you have bad skin issues. Oh, this is going on. Oh, just try the birth control pill."
Well, the reality is that the birth control pill gets prescribed in American medicine at the drop of a hat.
Mhm.
So, contraception is one reason, acne is another, painful periods, PMS. So, there's lots of different reasons that there's this knee jerk reaction. Oh, just regulate your hormones by going on the birth control pill. So, I don't like that approach because I feel like it doesn't address the root cause. It just suppresses the menstrual cycle and it doesn't look at the level of inflammation in the body. What I would have preferred if I was a clinician that you saw when you were a teenager and you had cystic acne, I would say, let's do a course of 6 weeks of an elimination diet where we cut out dairy, which we know causes cystic acne. We Let's also check your hormones, like look at your testosterone level to see if that's maybe driving some of your acne. Let's cut out gluten because that causes so much inflammation. Let's look at some of your micronutrients because maybe that's contributing to the acne that you're experiencing. Let's try to quell inflammation in your body by giving you some fish oil. So I'd like to try some of these lifestyle-based things first before that knee-jerk reaction to take the birth control pill. So you're right. I mean, there's lots of young women that get started for various reasons on the birth control pill. I think for the most part, it's overprescribed. And that may seem paradoxical with my first response to the FDA approving the mini pill, but I would say both are true. Women need more options, and they also need to know that the birth control pill does not regulate your cycle, it suppresses it. And so the more that you know about the natural cycles in your body, the more you know about body literacy, the better off you're going to be as you get older. I started the birth control pill when I was 16 because I had painful periods. And I was on it, for many years, and probably somewhat increased my risk of breast cancer associated with that. There are other benefits that I think are important to mention, including as you said at the beginning, it was developed in the 1960s. It gave women reproductive freedom in a way that they didn't have before that. And I think it's hard for us to even imagine what it was like to risk pregnancy every time you had sex, or to use a condom, which at that time I'm sure were not very good or comfortable. So on the one hand, I think it's really important that women have choices. On the other hand, I think the birth control pill is used too readily.
What is the reality of being on a a birth control pill? I know there's different ones for a decade plus, for really long-term use of it. I've heard so many different things.
Yeah. So benefit-wise, we know that reduces the risk of ovarian cancer.
Hmm.
So one of the things that raises your risk of ovarian cancer is what's known as incessant ovulation, which is when you ovulate every single month, and it kind of irritates the ovary and it leads to a greater risk of ovarian cancer. And that's why uh, nuns, women who generally were not pregnant and are not having sex and they ovulate every month, have a much greater risk of developing ovarian cancer than women who have had a couple of kids and have been on the birth control pill. So it's about 10% reduction of ovarian cancer per year up to 5 years. And then after 5 years, it's about a 50% reduction. So it's significant.
Wow.
Now, long term, it leads to these micronutrient depletions that I mentioned before. So, especially the B vitamins, magnesium, vitamin C. And if you combine that with someone who's really stressed, you really get, a lot of micronutrient depletions. And that can lead to things like fatigue, especially when you combine it with some genetic variations, such as problems with methylation or problems with detoxification. It can also change the microbiome. So we know that women who are on the birth control pill, and we've less data on the mini pill, so I don't know about the effect of the mini pill on the microbiome, the collection of microbes that you have in your gut plus their DNA. That's what the microbiome is. So it changes the microbiome. The classic birth control pill with ethinyl estradiol and progestin is associated with a greater risk of Crohn's disease, inflammatory bowel disease. So you want to be aware of that. You want to be aware of some of these long-term risks, the effect of lower testosterone. Testosterone is really important for women, even though we think of it as a male hormone. In women, the most abundant hormone that you make is testosterone. So we're very sensitive to it. And if you are decreasing your testosterone level by taking the birth control pill, and this is less of an effect with the mini pill versus the classic pill, that's associated with less agency, less confidence, less risk-taking behaviors, and potentially less muscle mass and less metabolic health as you get older.
Does it affect your ability to get pregnant or stay pregnant? Is there any data on that
Being on the birth control pill?
for a prolonged period of time?
Well, most people take it to prevent pregnancy. And then what's curious is when you stop it, I mean, there's lots of women who get pregnant when they're on the birth control pill because maybe they miss their window or they skip a pill, or it's just, it's not 100% effective. Abstinence is the only thing that's 100% effective. So that being said, there are some women who come off of the pill and they find that it takes longer to become fertile again. The classic thing is someone who is on the birth control pill maybe for 5 years or 10 years, and then they come off because they're ready to start planning a family and they're just not ovulating. So there are some hormonal changes, like with the sex hormone binding globulin that gets elevated with the ethinyl estradiol and the classic birth control pill. That leads to this higher sex hormone binding globulin, which soaks up the free testosterone. And that is still elevated a year out from stopping the pill. So it's not as high as it was when you're on the pill, but it's still elevated compared to your baseline. So that seems to be part of what's called the post-pill syndrome, which is kind of this prolonged hormonal dysregulation that can persist when you stop the birth control pill. And if that happens to any of our listeners, that's where I think working with a clinician is really important, usually a functional medicine doctor.
It's one of those questions about agency, right? Because everyone wants the choice to live the story that they want to live, and at some point in your life, that may mean not getting pregnant, and then at the next point in your life, it might mean getting pregnant, and you wonder how the decisions on either one affects the other one. All the storylines sort of connect. So that's one of the reasons why I ask about that. I think one of the broader questions about this, if we could expand it out a little bit, is that if this sort of birth control pill is available, others will come. And it may not stop there. It may not stop. I don't know where it could go as far as for women, for men, and kind of the hormone industry. I'm not talking about the science that you're doing, Dr. Gottfried. I'm talking about just that kind of the casual conversation that seems to be happening now around hormones. I'm just wondering what you think about that overall. Are hormones available over the counter? I don't know in what other capacity. Is that where science is going? Is that a good thing for men and women? Um, what what should we know? Because there's just so much talk. And I'm finding it's inundating, not just for me at this point in my life when I'm done having kids and kind of moving into the next chapter, but also for a lot of my younger friends in their 20s and my older friends who are in their 60s. It's just like it's everywhere. So
Right.
what do you think are the trends coming when it comes to hormones and availability of taking things that can affect our hormones? And what are your thoughts about that?
We already have a number of hormones that are available over the counter. So that includes DHEA, which is a precursor to testosterone. So there are some countries where that's by prescription only, but in the United States, the FDA has decided that that can be over the counter. So there's some risk associated with that. What I find with some of my patients who are doing a little citizen scientist experiment, they'll say, "Oh, I'm tired. I'm stressed. Let me take some DHEA and see if that gives me a little perk me up." And they'll go on the male dose of DHEA. So they'll take 25, 50, 100 milligrams. And then suddenly they've got cystic acne, greasy hair, road rage. So it raises testosterone, especially in women. And you need to have that body literacy to be aware of what you're taking. So I think there are some people who have body literacy. They're reading about DHEA. They understand some of the risks, benefits, and alternatives. They make an informed decision that I'm going to take this hormone over the counter, and it works for them. And then there are those who are more casual about it and often run into side effects and problems.
Hmm.
The same is true of pregnenolone. So pregnenolone is the mother sex hormone that goes on to make DHEA, testosterone, estradiol, cortisol, progesterone. And so some people take pregnenolone. It's especially true in Europe, where it's used much more often than in the US. So in terms of trends, I think that the trend that I'm excited about is democratization of health data. So we've got more and more consumers. We've got more and more direct-to-consumer testing that's available, where you can go to a place like Inside Tracker or WellnessFX, and you can do a hormone panel, especially if you have a clinician who says, "Oh, we don't measure hormones."
Oh my
They
gosh. Dr.
not.
Gottfried, I have to tell you this. I'm sorry to interrupt. I have to tell you. I was at the doctor's yesterday and I asked about this. And the clinician said to me, I'm not going to do that because your hormones change every hour. So it's really not worth measuring them. And I have nothing to compare them to. So it's just not worth it. It just literally just happened. And I want everyone to know that's not just a hyperbole from Dr. Gottfried. That literally happened to me yesterday because I said, oh, well, what lab should I get? Should I do some hormone readings? Oh, they change so much every hour. So
Yeah, but Jenna,
useless.
if you were trying to get pregnant and you're trying for a year to get pregnant and it's not happening, they're going to check every hormone in the book.
100%. Yes. Except, yes, absolutely. But
It's a
see,
double standard.
Total double standard. I completely agree. I couldn't believe it. I wasn't going to
So,
mention it in the interview, but how is that? I mean, it's 100% the truth, which is why I'm reading your books.
yeah, so a lot of women take things into their own hands and they go to one of these labs that's direct to consumer and they check their labs and they see that their DHEA is low. And so they start taking a DHEA supplement. Is that bad? No, I think it's, the FDA has decided it's safe. I feel like they're pretty good arbiters of what's safe, although I still think alcohol is like the worst drug out there, much worse than psychedelics. But I think the democratization of data, having access to more and more of your own data, like with wearables, I use a lot of wearables. I have a continuous glucose monitor in my arm. So having access to, the cycles, the natural cycles that your body goes through, understanding the way that you eat and how that affects your glucose, that's a huge trend. This trend toward consumers understanding their health in a deeper way, in a more comprehensive way, and not just outsourcing their power to their doctor that they see for 7 minutes once a year. And I
Is
think
that
that's
fact true for men too? By the way, is that 7 minutes true for women and then it's different for men, or is it 7 minutes across the board
it's 7
for it?
minutes across the board. Men just go to the doctor less.
Yes, right. I remember learning that during the pandemic.
Yep.
Yes, well, yes, that's I could probably the dentist less as well. No, that's really valuable information and something just for us all to think about what we have access to, and that's part of why I wanted to do this interview. I do have something to share with you. I always like to ask at the end of an interview, what is a smarter tip? I want to share with you one of the smarter tips that you already provided us and my family. It was your suggestion to add frozen broccoli to smoothies. And I thought this doctor is crazy. Are you that I don't even know if I like frozen broccoli that much. Are you kidding me? And you're like, "Oh, it's going to create this really creamy smoothie." I do it all the time. My kids drink it. Everybody in the household drinks it. And if it's one thing that changes in my life, I feel like it changed for the better. So that's one of the smarter tips you've already given us. I wanted to share that with everybody because they should try it. It's awesome. And it's very easy to do. And you don't taste frozen broccoli, just for what it's worth. But is there a smarter tip you could share with us about, is there any, whether it's a small change, something like that, or something just to consider if we're talking to a clinician about hormones, if we're reading about hormones, if we're seeing the news, is there anything based on your years of experience that you think, hey, this is something that can help you think a little smarter?
I'm obsessed with trauma. So I would say one of my tips is to Google adverse childhood experiences questionnaire, know your score. So if your score is 0, fantastic. Then you want to see if you have any adult trauma. But if your score is 1 or higher, you want to be aware of how that affects you in middle age. Because pretty much every chronic disease, we've now looked at about 45 chronic diseases, are connected to an elevated ACE score. So that's another tip. And then I would say in terms of frozen vegetables, I also like frozen cauliflower. It's got a little less taste than the broccoli.
Really? Okay.
Smoothies, so I like to, put a little avocado in there too to make it creamier. So a few other ideas for that smoothie.
I love that. Okay, I'll try the cauliflower. I once had a conversation with my husband. He'll never let me forget it. He was saying we need to eat more cauliflower, and I was like, "Aren't we supposed to eat colorful vegetables?" I'm like, I feel like cauliflower. He's like,
Well, it's white.
"You."
It's white.
Yes, that's what I know. That's what he's like. You need to Google cauliflower. I'm like,
It's good for you. Yeah.
it's excellent for you. There's all sorts of reasons you should eat it. Dr. Gottfried, thank you very much. This has been such a wonderful conversation. I think we covered a lot of ground and gave us amazing tips. And we would love to have you back when your book is out, when
Great.
your next book is out, to talk about. That's a whole area I know nothing about, and I would love to learn more about it. So I know it's due in March, so you just let us know. Your
Let's
open
do it.
invitation, come back whenever you'd like. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Quick, concise, nonpartisan, smarter news, a refuge from the storm. I'm Jenna. Thank you for choosing smarter.